So, hello everyone, and welcome to Neat, Plausible and Wrong, and our very first episode where we're going to be talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, yeah, this is an interesting one, and the reason that we're doing this is because actually in our conversations deciding on like what we were actually going to do together, this came up as something that we were both really interested in exploring further. So, this show is all about looking at different psychology theories that are used in business. And this is a really, really big one. I hear this so often in presentations and I've seen it so often in presentations. And it underpins a lot of how we're thinking about business psychology. So it's a really kind of foundational one. So we're going for one of the big ones first, I think. But yeah, so Miriam, for you, how would you describe it? How do you like as a theory? How does it work as a theory for you?
Yeah, so Maslow's hierarchy of needs for me, and by the way, hello everyone, is one of those motivational theories that was developed in the 1940s, 1943 to be specific, by Abraham Maslow, who was a psychologist. And it's, as Matthew said, it's influenced a lot of different workspaces. Thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's as if there is this logical, stepwise kind of needs that people have got to go through. For example, the first step would be the physiological needs, which would include such things as food, water, shelter, sleep. So the next step then would be around their safety needs, such as the security, stability, financial safety, freedom from harm, those sort of things. And the next step then, according to that hierarchy, would be a sense of belonging and maybe love, connections, such connections as would be formed socially, social connections or relationships, the community, and those special people that are in someone's life. The next one would be a step higher, which would be about the person, self-esteem needs, which would include such things as respect, maybe sense of self-worth, status. And the very top one would be then what the person wants for themselves after they've achieved all these basic and first stage or initial stage needs. And this is about self-actualization. So he talks about personal growth, creativity, realizing one's full potential, and being the person that you feel you are, the best version of you. And the assumption being that individuals need to satisfy the lower tier needs before progressing to the higher levels. And whilst one can move up, down, it is something that wouldn't be possible to move, for example, from physiological needs straight to self-actualization. And I think with this sort of understanding, a lot of companies have looked at how to motivate workers through achieving these basic needs.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. And I think for me, actually, one of the things that I'd like to add is self-actualization is a slightly strange term. It's the rest kind of makes sense without a less jargony. I think they kind of make sense, but self-actualization itself is it's actually quite a difficult concept. I dug into it looking into this, and it's like I feel like this is actually one of the what exactly represents self-actualization becomes very personal, and it's much less generalizable than the rest of the needs. And so you have this kind of pyramid where you get to this point at the top where you're kind of doing your own thing, which is interesting, and particularly in an organizational context. So how have you seen this applied in organizations in particular? How are businesses using this theory?
Yeah. So how a lot of the businesses that I have either worked for or worked with have been applying this theory is, in order for somebody to be productive, or in order to motivate someone so they can be their best in how they produce results for the company, they look at where they believe the person is. And if they are a new joiner, for example, they would hope that the person would want to ensure that they can pay their rent, they can get to work, they can have food, they can pay for food. So the basic salary would be something that they will be looking at to see how they can meet that, and to perhaps motivate the person to feel secure and safe in their job. There might be bonuses, there might be other financial or non-financial rewards that are given to the person, so as they can feel a particular way, they can feel that they have got a stability in that job. And further to that, some people would then look at, is this person a senior of some sort, or a leader of some sort, supervisor of some sort, in which case maybe they may want to feel like they belong to that company, in which case they can get maybe slightly more than what the average person gets. And it continues to be about looking at what the person is supposed to need from outside, rather than from what the person themselves say they feel they need. And the motivation is almost as if it's external rather than driven by the person themselves.
Yeah, it's a funny mixture, isn't it? Because I think, well, one of the issues is that if you follow this model, there's very limited scope for the higher level aspects. If you're lower in the organization, it's almost like, it's like the degree of personal freedom that you have, and the degree of like to actually be able to do this self-actualization process is something that really only occurs in the higher levels of most organizations. It's not something that's extended to people lower down anyway. So I think there's that kind of challenge, because you've got to meet all these other needs, and it's almost like they line up with the tiers in the organization.
Yeah.
So that definitely feels quite a limiting way of looking at what people can achieve and are motivated by. And I also feel like there's a slightly complex relationship with things like financial bonuses, because a financial bonus is largely going to apply to the lower levels. It's going to meet it's not really about our self-actualization, and money aren't being paid more money don't really sit very closely together. So I guess Maslow's hierarchy of needs does sit with the hygiene theory of motivation at work. You need to be paid enough, but being paid more doesn't really have any effect. So that's an interesting one for me. But equally, it doesn't fit with the way that a lot of businesses are actually behaving, particularly businesses. So I think there's an interesting thing there as to whether, well, is this theory working and businesses are behaving in ways that actually aren't aligned and aren't suiting them? Or is there something else that organizations are getting from paying bonuses that doesn't fit with the hierarchy of needs?
Yeah. And I also think, as you mentioned, that I'm thinking about the NHS, for example. Financial rewards are not exactly why people would work for the NHS, because if people wanted money, or if people were motivated by money, they wouldn't really be working for, most people wouldn't be working for the NHS, because the average worker doesn't get paid that kind of money that will satisfy a lot of their needs or motivate them in that sense. So perhaps different ways of being motivated might be important, or it is something else that is motivating people to do what they are doing.
Yeah, and I think this brings us on to thinking about maybe where Maslow's hierarchy of needs doesn't really work, or doesn't really seem to explain behavior. And I think that's a really good example. There are plenty of people that live actually quite precarious lives from a financial point of view, from a lower level needs point of view, because those are meaningful to them. And the NHS is a really good example. You know, like for a lot of people in the NHS, they're paid actually lives that paid to an extent that maybe they don't actually meet all of their lower level needs, but that they find the work a source of self-expression and a source of meaning. So I feel like, and I know, you know, a lot of in my work with people setting up purpose-led businesses, that's definitely the case. They're actually choosing more meaning over a much more precarious and like certainly the possibility that those lower level needs are not going to be met, at least in the short term. So I think in terms of that kind of that linear progression, that doesn't seem to be the way that everyone is approaching this.
Yeah. And I think if you also look at when it was developed and who it was developed for, I think the perspective that it was developed from was a neurotypical, neurodominant, Western and middle class perspective. And we do know now that there are a lot of other groups of people that don't really fit into this sort of niche or group. And many people experience motivation differently, where a higher need may be central to their well-being despite unmet lower needs.
And I've actually seen this in the reverse as well, kind of in the reverse way, in that the things that people have been rewarded for or given as a reward in an organization, they've actually experienced more like punishment, as something that's aversive, as something that they didn't want.
That's interesting, Matthew. Do you want to explain a bit?
Yeah, so the example of this is like, and this can be like true for quite a lot of neurodivergent people, but particularly for like quite a lot of autistic people, can be very uncomfortable being the center of attention, and it can feel very extremely uncomfortable. And there's a variety of reasons behind that, but if you reward someone for performance by kind of hauling them up in front of a whole load of people and then asking them to say something about what they've done, particularly without telling them that you're going to do that for some people that's exciting, I'm rewarded, you know, I get to talk about it. For other people that's a horrific experience. And I think so this kind of idea of like, and this relates to the belonging and the esteem of others, right? So this is in there as a thing. You're like, you get to bask in other people's approval of what you've done. For some people that would be really, really demotivating, that experience, and really, really unpleasant. So I think it's difficult both in terms of the order, as you've said, and the need, you know, the kind of particularly around purpose, and particularly I think around challenging power imbalance and that relationship with power. But it's also the case that the ways of achieving these things are often very different between people, even at the lower levels. And if an organization assumes that each of those needs are going to be met in the way that works usually for their most privileged people, honestly, it's going to make very serious mistakes about how those things manifest as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting really about rewards. When people are being called to be shown as the best example of this, or as having achieved this or the other, who is being rewarded? Who sees that as a reward? It's an interesting scenario there. And as you said, instead of it feeling satisfying or motivating someone, for certain neurodivergent people, and maybe even others that may not be neurodivergent, who have got a different personality perhaps, this may be hugely exposing for them. Therefore, it won't motivate them. Next time, they won't feel like they would want to do what it is that they did that has caused them to be rewarded this way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, yes, yeah. I can see how that is demotivating for certain people.
Yeah. I think the other thing I find really quite difficult with my experience of Maslow and trying to map it onto experience is that it sees the things as kind of linear. It sees you've got these higher level things, you do these baseline things, and then they achieve these. then you do the next thing. Whereas for me, these things are often very cyclic and interrelated. So I think for an example about this is if you think about, you think about maybe an aesthetic need. So the need to appreciate nice things. Let's use that. Let's use being in nature as an example of an aesthetic need. We know that being in nature has a whole load of really positive physiological effects. So we know that, and we know that it's really good for us in a variety of ways that speak to the much lower needs. So it has needs across, it has benefits across a whole load of different things, and those are related. And you need so there's this, but you need a certain level of freedom. You need a certain level of health to be able to go and do these. So I think it speaks to the idea that these can be neatly separated. Again, talks to what you were saying about where it comes from, and that the fact that for some people those things won't be accessible because they're interrelated, and you'll hit these barriers where, well, you can't have this because you can't have that, and that they don't fit with that linear process.
Yeah, and I think from what you are saying, it throws me into where the model, whilst it assumes this linear kind of progression, it doesn't consider that needs fluctuate in reality, and they may overlap. And what we may think are needs, or the basic needs for someone, they may not be those basic. For example, if you look at how certain people, neurodivergent individuals, may look at the concept of self-actualization. It's very, as you were saying, not only does it sound abstract, it's very personal. For someone, mastering a specific skill or creating a life that aligns with their needs, or finding fulfillment outside conventional achievement models might be their sense of self-actualization. And in terms of the ableism or in terms of some of the structures that may make this difficult, ableism is one of them, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the idea that these levels are achievable, and I think also for me, what means that one level is satisfied before another one becomes relevant is, again, if we have ongoing health issues for a variety, it's like we can never achieve like that need being fully met. So does that mean that we're denied everything above it? And that feels quite that feels very ableist, and we see this in wider discourse sometimes, where this idea of like, well, if you're disabled, you're not really allowed, there's a societal expectation that you won't have a job that's meaningful, you won't maybe even find you won't be able to have meaningful relationships with other people. So I think this assumption is there in society, and it's interesting that it highlights it, but I don't think it's true. And I think it's a very unhealthy thing for us to base our assumption, our decision making upon.
Yeah.
So what can we still take from Maslow's hierarchy of needs? What can we safely take from it?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of things we can still take from it. It provides, as we can see, an easy to understand framework for thinking about human motivation, and it acknowledges that people have got different needs, but perhaps those needs are not as hierarchical. Still, we can take the idea that people have got different needs. I think there is also this idea about psychological and social well-being. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory has been used to perhaps structure employee benefits, leadership development, wellness programs. So for that reason, I think it's still quite relevant, but maybe it needs to be personalized rather than what is thought of by those that make those sort of programs.
So we can still use the basic idea that we have a variety of needs, and some of those needs might need to be met in a specific order in a given context.
And in a different way.
Yeah. But we have to be much more flexible about the ways that we might meet them, and the fact that the order might change.
Yeah.
And
the order also might change. It might also be up and down, overlap, and sometimes not exist in the way that we see it normally.
Yeah, I think for me, it's understanding that it's a partial picture.
Yeah,
it's thinking about this thing as it's kind of a snapshot, I think. And for me, if you think more in a more process orientated way and think more over time, it's useful to see it as part of an ongoing process. But if we see it as the whole process, that's when it starts to become really quite problematic in terms of how it's actually going to motivate people.
One other thing that I think I have liked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, not all of it, of course. One thing I have liked is the recognition of psychological and so. Oh, there you are.
Hello. Yeah, it cut out. I think the connection cut out.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there. But yes, I was talking about, would you like me to continue about what? Yes. Some of the things that I think I still like about it is, unlike other purely economic or efficiency-driven theories, it includes emotional and social needs in what motivates people.
Yeah, it does acknowledge that there are intrinsic needs. I think that's a really important thing when, it's very much, and particularly at the time it came out, that was not something that really was widely accepted or widely understood. And it went against the grain to some degree in terms of this idea that we were entirely motivated by these external things that were always happening to us, and we kind of almost had rote responses to whatever was happening in the environment. And the idea that we have personal, internal things driving us is really, really important. And yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important aspect of it. So yeah, completely.
Yeah.
So when you're working with this kind of thing, are there any other models? Do you have your own model, or do you have any other models that you like to use to think about motivation and the space that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is often used in?
Funny you should ask that. Not long ago, I was talking to this group of people just to get a sense of what they think what they know motivates them, what they think motivates other people. And there wasn't one particular theory or model that would explain this. But what was common in all the narratives was that people would like to feel included in what it is that motivates them. And also to have people that make decisions realize that whatever motivates them depends on where they are in their lives and what else is happening in their lives. Therefore, motivation, I think from that point of view, is defined by the person. Whilst we may have these theories to make things look a little bit neat, they may not work so well. It's what works for the person, what motivates the person. Is it external factors? Is it internal factors? Is it a combination? Is it also other things that may vary from time to time? So I wouldn't say I have got a specific model that I use, but I look at what is happening for the person. How safe do they feel within themselves? What's happening to their health, physical health, emotional health, social health? That might be having an impact on what they are prioritizing as their need.
Absolutely. And I think there's a couple of things I've come across that I use sometimes around this that actually speak very much to what you were talking about. The first one of them is self-determination theory, which talks very much to intrinsic need and how we're kind of looking at our needs on an ongoing basis. And that identifies these areas of autonomy, competence, and connectedness as the drivers, these three interrelated drivers around what motivates our behavior, particularly our intrinsic behavior. And I think as a guide towards what you can do as an individual, I find that really helpful, because it's how can you increase those. One of the difficulties I find with Maslow's hierarchy of needs is it doesn't really talk about how. How do you go? That's kind of left, particularly at the higher levels. It's just you do this as if it were obvious. And for those of us who don't fit the kind of model and the societal norms as well as others, how you do that is very much non-obvious. And so I really like the fact that self-determination theory kind of gives you some more sense of like, how do you locate that in the person? How do you locate that in yourself? How do you explore that yourself? And look at these various areas and maybe when one of them is being particularly unmet, why does this feel unmotivating? Why does this feel bad? Why am I avoiding this? Is also a really useful question, because I think that's another area where it doesn't really talk, when we think it's very easy to fall into that normative trap of like, well, all of my lower level needs are met, so why aren't I motivated to do the next thing? And I think then it's easy to think of ourselves as lazy or to think of ourselves negatively, and that's a real risk. And I think using another model can be really helpful for being like, well, that doesn't align with my intrinsic needs, or that I don't actually have a viable pathway to doing that. So I think that's a really helpful thing. The other thing where you mentioned safety is, I think the power, threat, meaning framework is quite useful in understanding, where we are motivated, particularly in response to, I think it's useful for thinking about things like compliance, why someone does what they are told or not, even when we think it might be in their interests to do it or not. And I think in business, that's a really interesting one. It's like, when you think about things like change resistance as a concept, which I think we're going to get to in a later, I hope we're going to get to in a later conversation, but, when you think about like, well, are people's interests really aligned? Are the power relations of this actually, is it just that people are doing what they're told when they're not really getting anything out of it? And is that why they're not doing what we expect from what we've told them? So there's a ton of stuff in there really about understanding the external stuff as well. So I think for me, self-determination theory to better understand and explore the internal stuff, and the power, threat, meaning framework perhaps to better explore the kind of more of the stick type motivations, the things that might be pushing us as well. So
that's the self-determination theory is I quite like that, especially considering the interconnectedness of needs rather than needs being standalone. And I also like it. I like that it recognizes alternative forms of belonging, where perhaps it doesn't necessarily mean belonging as part of close relationships, but how it can be found in structured interactions or online communities or deep engagement with a personal passion.
And I think that personal nature of motivation feels like the really big takeaway from this, is that we are
Yeah.
motivated by different things in different orders, and even where we have a similar kind of outcome motivation, we might do that in very different ways. We might seek to achieve that in extremely different ways, even at the lower levels of the pyramid that Maslow identifies. So I think for me, it's taking away that flexibility and allowing, and when we're talking about organizations, thinking about how we can flexibly allow people to meet needs, because that's one of the big places. If we just assume when we're working with people in the organization that it's going to happen in the same order and it's going to be the same things that meet those needs, we're going to implicitly support one group and explicitly and implicitly marginalize everyone else who experiences the world differently.
Everyone else who already is being marginalized, we are going to be worsening that sense.
Almost certainly, yeah. And I think that idea of, whose experience are we fitting everything else to, is a really important question when we're looking at this kind of thing in an organization. It's like, are we just saying there's a specific sort of person who has these specific sort of needs and does it in this specific sort of order, and this is the only sort of person who this organization is really easily going to work with, and everyone else has to work around that? Because I think if we misapply the hierarchy of needs, we can definitely do that.
As we are talking, I was thinking about what that model might look like, that not just considers some of the good stuff from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, elements from the self-determination theory, and the flexibility. And what comes into my mind is an interconnected model, which has got bits from different parts of different models, bits that work for different groups of people at different times. And there is a certain fluidity and flexibility within this interconnected model. It's almost like a matrix.
Yeah, I think rather than a pyramid, a matrix of needs, whilst harder to conceptualize and perhaps harder to work with, is a much better representation of how we really experience this kind of thing, for sure.
And you know what, when you were talking about how those needs for different people and how we can be inclusive and not just cater to one group, it also sounds very much like we are asking people to define for themselves what matters, what their goals are, what motivates them. And it's almost as if we are looking at non-linear growth. Yeah, but growth all the same.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of summing it up and a great place to end, really. So if this has been helpful to you, please do comment, engage, let us know, ask any questions that you have as a result, and we'll bring any questions in that we can answer in subsequent episodes. And yeah, please do let us know if it's been useful to you, and thank you, and hope to see you very soon. Goodbye.
Bye.